All right, good morning and good evening. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar on refugee response efforts during COVID-19, lessons from Turkish CSOs, civil society organizations. My name is John from HasNa, and we are a Washington, DC based nonprofit that has been working at the intersection of peace building and development in Turkey since around 1998. So before I introduce my panel, let me tell you a little bit about why we're gathering here today. As many of you know, Turkey hosts more refugees than any other country, primarily as the result of the Syrian civil war. And since 2011, Turkey has done much to deal with this wave of human displacement, and civil society organizations have taken on increasingly important roles to meet the needs of refugees, and also more recently to help promote their harmonization into the societies, so within the Turkish communities that have now become their homes. So this has never been more true than during coronavirus, which has added another layer of complexity to the activities of the civil society organizations that are here with me today, as well as the hardships faced by the refugees. Recently, we at HasNa launched the Turkey Refugee Response Initiative to explore the ways that civil society, local governments, international aid agencies, academia, and local communities have been working with Turkey's refugee populations. And this initiative ultimately aims to amplify the voices from Turkey that are working on the front line with refugees. So as part of this initiative, we at HasNa launched or published a report on the ways that coronavirus has affected the work of civil society organizations that are working with refugees. Here we primarily focused on the hurdles in the areas of social cohesion and access to employment, but hopefully during this discussion we might be able to get to some other topics that are also pertinent to the issue. Without going into too much detail, I think that most of my panelists would agree that refugees have been hit hardest by the pandemic in many ways. So for the sake of time, I won't go into the backgrounds of our panelists too much. But you can find all of their bios on our event page at hasna.org, and links to their organizations should have been provided in the chat box. So I'm joined today by 4 representatives from some of Turkey's most active international and local civil society organizations. We have Fatih Kiman from Support to Life, or Hayata Destek. We also have Ömer Kaya from the Vatan Foundation. We have Shilan Kurush from AAR Japan. And we also have Sude Karanfil from the Refugees and Asylum Seekers Assistance and Solidarity Association, or RASAS for short. So we welcome all of your questions from the audience, and we'll leave some time at the end of the discussion to go over them. We recommend that you submit them through the Zoom Q&A feature. And you can also tweet us at HasNa Inc. And we will be broadcasting this conversation live on YouTube. So with that, let's jump into the questions. So this first question is directed towards you, Ömer. So I wanted to ask, how have civil society organizations sort of navigated the restrictions posed by the pandemic, and particularly the lockdown? And what are some ways that your work has been affected? And have you found any creative or innovative ways that have been used to continue your work?
Thank you, John, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone who are attending from different parts of the world. It's a pleasure to be here with the respected and valuable other guest speakers, and also to be hosted by HasNa. So to respond to your question, the answer is yes, definitely it was impacted, and actually it's deeply impacted. We have, for instance, an ongoing protection community center in Ankara, which we had to close a little bit more than 1 month. And especially while implementing a project to cover the protection risks, to close the center for 1 month, it's creating an additional impact on the refugee community, because we are providing services such as legal consultation, linking them to the provided services. So when there is no center which is linking them to those services, then it's not only having different type of negative impact, but also having an impact to reach to access to the services. So definitely, yes, it is impacted, but we did our best, even during when the center was closed or the other services are not, could not be provided in person. So the type of solutions we could find was, first of all, for instance, to provide psychosocial support or legal consultation through phone calls. Or we have an ongoing project in Antakya. So due to the restrictions, basically it's closed, but there is a social cohesion component in the project. So when you cannot gather children, it's quite hard to do the social cohesion. So what we did, in cooperation with a social enterprise established in Istanbul, we did conduct social cohesion activities online with a methodology called Gameathon. Sounds like marathon, but it's more like playing games and learning together marathon. So that's why it's called Gameathon. So the host community and the refugee community children had the chance to be online, to attend a series of workshops such as painting together, story writing, and different type of workshops. So just to wrap up, yes, it is deeply impacted, the intervention that we have on the field, but we did our best to find some innovative solutions by using the technological devices or the methodologies. But just the last sentence, it's not always the best idea to use technology. Sometimes it is exclusive due to the limited equipment or limited conditions of the refugee communities, especially. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know during our report, we talked with a lot of organizations and they expressed concern that some of the refugee communities didn't have computers to access online activities by your organizations, or the educational, education had been moved online during the pandemic. So yeah. All right, next question is for you, Sudhe. So even though COVID-19 may be seen as a temporary break in normal refugee response efforts, it may have some lasting effects. And I was just wondering if in your work, if you've noticed any ways that there might be a long-term impact in the ways that you work in general.
Firstly, hello, and thank you for your invitation. I'm very really excited to be here with you. And as you said, my name is Sude Karanfil, and we, of course, we saw noticed lots of problem in there, and we has been working in field and look for people needs in that period. And the most important problem was unemployment. We worked with Sultanbeyli municipality VEFA groups, and we show unemployment will be really big problem in the future also. Many people who are working without social security lose their job without any payment, and we predict it will affect their future also. And in that period, we think how we fix that problem. We came together with our donors, UNHCR, GIZ, and Relief International, and more, and we try to solve that problem. And with UNHCR and Sultanbeyli municipality, we began our career center project to solve that problem and help that people to on their unemployment period in COVID period. And we try to decrease effect of pandemic period, and particularly in this period we began our career center project to decrease effects of pandemic period. Second problem and second and significant problem was people to be in home, all family member in one home, and they lose their job and they're spending their all time in their home, and it's called lots of violence and abuse into the family. And we make, and there was lots of psychological problems, we notice them, and we made collaboration with Cordep, a Cordep project, and we offer psychological support via online platforms with refugees in Rasas. And thirdly, we lose our communication with children in that period because of schools closed, and it was big problem to don't reach the childrens and don't any and didn't take any um, information from them. And we make we make project with our teachers to fix that problem and reach them. We make some online areas, and we try to follow them and solve their all problems in the cooperative viewpoint. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that a lot of you have been working under sort of difficult conditions and been faced with something new or a little bit unexpected, obviously, with the pandemic. I think we all have, but you in particular working with refugees. So this third question is for you, Fatih. So seeing that Hayata Destek, or Support to Life, is an organization with its roots in emergency and disaster response, I was wondering if you could think of any steps or actions that could be taken by, you know, anyone, whether it's international community, the national government, your organization itself, that could create a culture of preparedness, and possibly to help other civil society organizations have this preparedness too, that helps just, you know, deal with the additional layers of complication that has been added to your work and the beneficiaries' hardship throughout the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. And I also would like to begin by thanking you and thanking all the participants for being here. It's a pleasure to be here to exchange ideas and share our experiences. And to respond to your question, let me begin by saying this. This pandemic we are experiencing still is most definitely a global disaster and a global emergency that disrupted the daily lives of nearly everyone on the planet. And this, ironically in a way, is an opportunity or a wake-up call, so to say, to put disaster preparedness high in the public agenda. Future. And there are many levels on how we should do this, what we do, how the resilient society ecosystem.
So Fatih, you're cutting out a little
How
bit.
do we build resilient public institutions? Oh, okay, I will just try to slow down and make sure my points are not missed, but unreliable network I have, I'm not gonna deny it.
Now it's perfect.
Now it's better? Okay, I'll go on with my response then. So I was just saying that there are many levels to this response, as in on what level do we situate the resilience, and they could be associated with the civil society, with public institutions, with our economies, with our supply chains. We could go on, but the answers to these questions are interrelated. As CSOs working in the area of humanitarian aid, and since we have our roots in the emergency response area, it is clear that we must do more in terms of anticipatory disaster action. So we must prepare before the disaster happens, obviously, but we must also advocate and work for disaster resilience in both within our areas and outside our areas. And how do we do that? First, we must first assess our own capacities in terms of disaster resilience, assess the risks that are within our standard operations and have contingency procedures in place to mitigate those risks. We must also secure standby emergency funds, as they are called, as already thought out additional components in our projects and interventions. And actually many donors offer these standby emergency funds, so funds that will be allocated for emergency action if needed. And as a second step, we must then help other key stakeholders build their capacities in this regard. We can do this through our own cooperation networks. We can easily help others gain new skills, and we can encourage them to learn from good practices in this area. And third, we must also promote disaster awareness among the general public as well, who in return may demand sound decision-making from decision makers, from policymakers, both at the local and national level, which would in turn, of course, catalyze bottom-up change and improvement in this regard. Of course, this is easier said than done, especially in areas where there are pre-existing humanitarian urgencies because local capacities are already overstretched. Yet at the local and national levels, the best way we can do is to help build capacities, create an accessible knowledge base for our mutual stakeholders, disseminate good practices, and help raise awareness for positive outcomes in preparedness. And as for the international community, which I think was a part of your question, there's a key point to be made about localization of humanitarian aid, which since 2016 is a hot topic. And during the pandemic, let's remember that we saw national isolation measures kick in, borders were closed, mobility of people and goods were restricted. And this, of course, showed us that north to south cooperation, while it has its own set of advantages, it is not a resilient mechanism when people's and mobility of goods are restricted. Let's remember that at the height of the pandemic, the disruption of the supply chains was also a huge issue. We began speaking of shortages of all sorts of goods in many countries, ranging from staple foods and medical equipment, and this created vulnerabilities. And I'll give you even on a domestic scale, I can give you a specific example how thinking local is important to build resilience. And the pandemic showed us exactly that. For instance, in mid-March, we were responding to the post-earthquake emergency situation in Elazığ, which was struck by an earthquake back in January. And we were in the process of prepping ourselves to distribute some hygiene items. And due to the pandemic-induced demand, consumer demand on hygiene items, and also the restricted mobility of people and goods, we had great difficulty in getting these goods supplied on time, and we could only, after certain delay, solve this issue because we've been operational in the area for a long time and had good knowledge of the local supply network. And this already is once again a case in point for localization and how localization can contribute to resilience. Putting all this together, I will say that for increased disaster preparedness, we need increased cooperations, both horizontally and vertically. And by horizontal, I mean across different actors. And by vertical, I mean, of course, at the local, national, and international levels.
Yeah, thank you very much for that response. I think it was very thorough, some good insight. So yeah, I'll move on to the next question, and I will direct this towards you, Shilan. So right now in Turkey, and so refugees have been in Turkey for quite a while now, a lot, so over 3.6 million, and the Syrian civil war is not showing much of a sign of ending. So I was wondering how social harmonization or social cohesion has been prioritized in AAR Japan's work, and how are these interventions or projects being received by both beneficiaries and the host communities themselves?
Hello everyone, I am very glad to attend this activity. So as AR Japan, we are working in the field more than 8 years in Turkey. We have different programs. In our case management program, we are working with people with disabilities and child protection cases. We provide basic medical items to beneficiaries when needed. But our case management program was just for refugee population until this year. So when we talk about our program, or when we went to distribution, we were getting a lot of feedbacks from the field, from the local organization or governmental institutes, such as why we don't include Turkish citizens, why we don't include host community, etc. So, and also there's a misunderstanding like that NGOs provide excessive amount of cash assistance to Syrians, or a lot of food baskets or other needs are covered by government or NGOs in Turkey. So we decided to include Turkish citizens in our project to amplify conflict between Syrians and host community. So, and also we started another project during the pandemic. We started to distribute e-voucher card, digital market card, which beneficiaries can go to use market. We are sending their information via SMS to them. Both host community and refugee population can benefit from this card. We are working with Ministry of Family, Labor and Social Services in this project. We are taking the list from them. In this project, our main criteria is disability. We have another program named Community Support Program. We have committees for people with disability and children. Main goal of the committees is providing social inclusion and to support social cohesion. In these committees, committee members come and discuss their difficulties, make suggestions and plan activities, and we provide every arrangement for them they need. This committee includes both host community and refugees, and we are considering to we always consider the gender balance and include host community as well as refugee population. As a good practice, I can say one of our committees wrote a theater text and they acted together. The play was about difficulties which people with disabilities face, and the actors and actresses were committee members who have disabilities. There were Syrians, Iraqis, and Turkish citizens together in this theater play. We also have children committees. We always try to prioritize peers from same classes and schools or neighborhoods, because as you may know, peer bullying in schools to Syrian children is a very common problem in Turkey. So we are trying to build the relationship and avoid the conflict by these committees. And we observe that even after the committee, they continue their friendship, which they built in the committee activities that host community children and Syrian children. Despite the pandemic, we are trying to keep in touch with beneficiaries and keep committees active. As an example, in children committee, children wanted to conduct painting and reading activities. We distributed painting materials and books they chose. They are sharing their drawings in the WhatsApp group, and they share the books after they finish to read with each other. So this committee includes both host community and refugees, of course. And in addition, I want to say that as we observe, refugee population is very eager to attend mutual events with host community. They say they don't know how long they will stay in Turkey, and they want to know host community better. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for that response. I know in our conversations with NGOs and CSOs, I think a lot of the emphasis was on that, you know, we also have to focus on the host community as well. It's the host community and the refugees. And I think a lot of times that one-sided integration or harmonization is not helpful. That's one sort of lesson we learned. Okay, now I will move on to you, Sude. So like you just said, seeing that you work closely with the Sultanbeyli municipality, and you spoke earlier about the VEFA groups, I was wondering, what does coordination between civil society organizations, private enterprise, and public institutions or bodies look like? And how can this cooperation be strengthened, especially in times like these?
Yes, we're working with a comprehensive perspective, as I say, and we serve with 24 different areas like protection, physiotherapy, psychosocial support, and career center, social cohesion, and more to refuge. And when we are creating many different projects in that areas, while we are creating them, we mind to make a collaboration with private enterprise and public bodies, and because they offer a lot of opportunity. in COVID period, it was the best example of that opportunities to see. And with Sultanbeyli municipality, we work with them, their VFR group, as you said, and we has been working in field until it's COVID beginning. When COVID began, we start with working with them, and we have a database systems to come, and we took our peoples who are under who are 60, and we search them, and we worked with VFR groups to reach them in that period, and Sultanbeyli municipality support in that areas to us. And if we want to make more collaboration with them, I think we should see our strength points, and we should know each other's better, and we should see the opportunity and combine them. It is really important, and it shows lots of opportunity to us. And I can say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sude Hanım. Yeah, I'll just take this opportunity to remind everyone that we will be answering questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit them through the Q&A or in the text box here. But yes, moving on, I will direct this towards you, Ömer. So for those who are watching at home or work or both, who haven't read the report yet, can you tell us, so one of the things that we focused on was access to the labor market for refugees. So do you think that you can tell us about some ways that civil society helps to encourage refugees, as well as, once again, host communities, Turkish citizens, access to the labor market? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, to be very frank, I don't have a clear answer or a posh answer for that, because the whole planet is going through a hectic period, so no one knows. Of course, in such cases, the refugee communities are impacted more, and it's now much harder to access the labor market, maybe double or triple times, because the private sector is surely impacted by COVID-19. They had to close their businesses. They couldn't open it, they couldn't make the sale, and they didn't have the income, and so on and so forth. So the first action is mostly decrease the costs to the company. And it usually goes with terminating some contracts or stopping any recruitment processes. But what is more concerning is companies might intend to recruit people informally more than ever, because as mentioned, no one knows what's going to happen after 3 months. There are lots of discussion on political level, on technical level, on different type of levels, but still no one has the answer what's going to happen in the next quarter or the quarter following the next quarter. So that's why it's a period with lots of unclarity, and that in short, medium, or long term, it's impacting the refugee community the most. But as civil society organizations, we also as Watan, and I know all the organizations that the other respected guest speakers are coming from very well from the field. Of course, we will continue our efforts to increase the access to the market of host and refugee communities at the same time. But as humanitarian organizations, our main focus is, or will be, for the refugee communities. But as my colleague mentioned in the question, 2 questions before, now it's more a trend to focus and include the host community as well for big number of reasons. And for this regard, actually, at least I can talk about Watan, that we have developed some number of concept notes and as well as programs specifically focusing on increasing the access of the refugees and the host community to the labor market. But as I said, for instance, the same time of this year, last year, like last August 2019, we could talk about that the market requires X number of qualified people for X number of jobs. So we are not that sure that still that need it's still over there, because most of the private sector got smaller and it continues to be shrinked. So it requires, I believe, a little bit more digging and research and more closer cooperation, actually direct cooperation with the private sector. Maybe I could put a critics to the civil society organizations, starting from myself, from my organization, not to point out anyone. I think the level of cooperation with the private sector directly has to be escalated to the maximum level. Otherwise, it will be not implementing a good level, the projects with good level of impact, and actually as concretely making available jobs for the refugee communities or for the host community as well. So just to wrap up, the case for the refugees, it's way more difficult than before, but still, I mean, this is the reason why we exist as the civil society organizations, to deal with extremely complex and challenging situations. So we will continue to do our best in cooperation with all the relevant actors, such as UN agencies, local, national, international NGOs, state departments, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ömer. I know that you know, the economic situation in Turkey right now is could possibly have a negative effect on everyone, including refugees, and that is sort of a worrying trend if you know, you think that informal employment may be offered more than ever throughout this period. But like you said, it's something that we need to keep an eye on and keep working on. So yeah, my next question will go to you, Shilan. So in our report, we talked about barriers to employment, informal employment that were already present in refugee communities, and that in some sense have been amplified by the pandemic. So, but we didn't really get to go into in depth into the gendered effects of the pandemic. So having to do with gender, different ways that it's affected women versus men. Or we didn't have a way to, or we didn't really go into depth on other vulnerable populations within the refugee communities, such as those with disabilities. And I know that that AR Japan is working with beneficiaries with disabilities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Since as AR Japan, we don't have a program which directly focuses on SGBV, sexual gender-based violence cases. So I can't give you our internal feedbacks or numbers, but we have coordination with most of the NGOs, especially local NGOs who directly work with women. They mentioned that they have a significant increase of domestic violence cases. There are some studies and reports made in Turkey during pandemic process. So I can give you some examples from there. According to Turkey Women Organizations Federation, there is almost 60% of increase on violence against women comparing to March 2019. It is really a high number that we need to think about it. And also on another report, more than 75% of Syrian refugees mentioned that they face a kind of violence during the pandemic, physical or economic or psychological violence. And also there is another difficulty on SGBV cases, is that all counseling services are provided remotely during this time. Face-to-face services and shelter services are limited and harder to reach, unfortunately. On a field study which Care International represented, more than 40% of Syrian female employees lost their job, and almost 20% of female employees were forced to unpaid leave. I can share these reports after the event if you want. For people with disabilities, on a report, 60% of people with disabilities reported difficulties to reach health services during the pandemic. It is a really high number. As AR Japan, our case management and community support activities are going on remotely. We are not going to field, we are not counseling face-to-face. We are assessing case through the phone. Our committees are conducting via WhatsApp groups and online activities. When we receive an SGBV case, a domestic violence case, we are referring and guiding to relevant organization through the phone. However, we can say that participants of the committees decreased excessively. Beneficiaries, especially people with disabilities, doesn't recommend activity plans anymore. Because our main goal was supporting people with disabilities to attend social life more and more. But in these conditions, most of our beneficiaries said they couldn't go out from the beginning of pandemic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know I have heard in multiple reports that gender-based violence has increased during the coronavirus period. And yeah, once again, that could be, it's a worrying time. Okay, so I'm going to pose one last question before we get to Q&A. So yeah, we have a few questions from Q&A, and I'll get to those in a moment. But so first, this question will be directed towards you, Fatih. So sort of wrapping up and looking towards the future, what do you think are the most important lessons of this pandemic, if any, and particularly obviously as they relate to refugee response and harmonization efforts as well?
Thank you, John. Actually, I'll ask for a tiny clarification about that last notion, how you use the notion harmonization. By that, do you refer to harmonization between different domains of intervention within humanitarian aid, within different sectors, or do you refer to social cohesion related intervention?
Social cohesion, social harmonization.
Okay, because I realized in the beginning of the meeting that you use harmonization within that context, and I wasn't sure if that's what you meant.
Yeah.
Okay, let me respond to that. Indeed, during the pandemic, the risks posed to public health were at the forefront for both refugee and host communities alike. Even though, as my colleagues observed, the refugee community was affected the hardest for all sorts of reasons due to the lack of economic resilience, which manifests itself in the form of lack of the access to formal jobs, lack of economic savings, but also for lesser knowledge of how to access basic rights and services, obviously. But apart from the health impacts, as my organization or I am not an expert on domains of health myself, I will focus perhaps more a bit on the secondary impacts of COVID that we experienced, and what can be done, and how it manifests itself in processes associated with social cohesion and associated with tensions that we unfortunately experience more and more, witness more and more at the local levels. So first of all, since we were just discussing the economic situation in Turkey a moment ago, it's important to state that even before the pandemic, we knew that 1/3 of the labor market in Turkey was informal. That means already within the host community, 1/3 of the population is working on informal jobs, which are essentially insecure jobs with no social security, and that often involve working for long hours for low pay. This being the situation, and this being a country that hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, with the economic outlook deteriorating, we observed that the social climate morphed into a situation where the number of people that in an earlier poll responded to the question, would you have a Syrian neighbor in your building and be happy about it? The people that responded that they said they would be unhappy were only at like 30%, 40%, but with economic outlook deteriorating, we saw this number go up as high as 75%. And ironically, we saw that this number was highest in the Black Sea region, which is the region that hosts the least number of refugees in Turkey. And this number, as ironic as it is, gives us hope, because essentially this is a fear of the unknown. This is not because we have a systemic problem of negative coping mechanisms that manifests itself as increased criminal activity among Syrians. No, we don't observe this in a systematic fashion. Furthermore, we see a lot of disinformation circulating, as my colleague stated, about how much support, financial or otherwise, is being given to Syrian refugees. We, as humanitarian actors, both during the pandemic and before the pandemic, have been prioritizing our key messages, so to say, to communicate to the public about what the humanitarian situation is in Turkey, who is doing what about this. This includes the interventions by the humanitarian sector. This involves the support provided by government actors. So transparency in this regard is the key. But what has changed with the pandemic? Let's ask ourselves that question. What has changed in Turkey and elsewhere? Let's again remember what happened. The areas that were struck by the pandemic earliest were in Europe, in the US, in Turkey, were areas where mobility of people were the highest. And when people think mobility, they think migration, forced, regular, irregular, otherwise, doesn't matter. So now we have a social climate as fresh as it is. The initial reports and observations are that the pandemic puts us at an increased risk in which we see refugees, irregular migrants, or regular migrants being stigmatized more and more due to the mobilities that are perceived to come with risks. And lastly, going back to the economic situation and what the associated research has to say about this, I will wrap this up by saying that both for regular and irregular migration, all available research shows us that in the long run, countries that host a large number of refugees, when they implement the right policies to boost social cohesion, when they implement the right strategies to counter misinformation, there is a net economic gain to be made in terms of innovation, in terms of participation to employment, and in terms of productivity of employment. And as humanitarian actors, we are trying to step out of our comfort zone and facilitate the implementation of these projects, these interventions, by cooperating more and more with developmental actors. In the near future, we know that World Bank will be a big player in the refugee area. We know that European Bank of Development will be coming into Turkey to support more development-oriented interventions. And frankly, we are looking forward to it, because this will reflect positively on social cohesion, on participation to employment, on economic resilience of refugees. So we will be able to address these problems more holistically, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that response. So yeah, with this, I'm just going to jump into Q&A, questions from the audience. We've gotten some good questions. And so Fatih, I'm just going to continue with the subjects that you've brought up in social cohesion. So this question is more or less saying that it's important, and that some studies on social cohesion have emphasized the need to switch from a burden approach to an opportunity approach when it comes to dealing with refugees or helping to maintain or empower their resilience. So does anyone, I guess I could direct this towards you, Omar. Do you have any recommendations on how CSOs can highlight the opportunities that are inherent for within the refugee community?
Yeah, the question is related to social cohesion. I think I raised that a couple of times in the meetings that are led by UN or informal meetings that we are having over a coffee with other colleagues from other NGOs. I think as civil society organizations, we should first of all agree how we see the social cohesion concept itself. Because sadly, still in the 7th, 8th years of this crisis, we see some activities that are named as social cohesion, but taking children or young people or adults to a museum and then not providing any additional input, but then asking them to leave, and then it's so-called social cohesion, and it's repetitively continuing, and unfortunately lots of time and budget is spent on that. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, there is a very good effort and activity taking place on the field, but I think we should accept that the whole social cohesion concept is also is something that we also need to explore very well, and then plan together, and then have a similar, of course it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but a similar approach and kind of standard that when we are doing the operation. Regarding the responding the question very quickly, not to take a lot of time, definitely it's an opportunity. I mean, it's not a burden. It's not the specific case for Turkey with the Syrians or the other nationals, other refugee nationals. It's the same opportunity if you go to Germany, if you go to UK, if you go to Canada, it's the same. However, as civil society organizations, again, let me put a self-critic that we have to be much more active of putting pressure on decision makers to develop durable and sustainable policies regarding the social cohesions, rather than organizing one-shot activities, including local authorities, civil society organizations, and so on and so forth. The answer is definitely it's an opportunity to learn how to live together and to build an amazing future together.
All right, thank you. All right, let's get into some more questions. So I think that this question is very pertinent and topical. It's about Pinar Gültekin. So recently in Turkey, there has been a little bit of unrest following the death of Pinar Gültekin and the talk of withdrawing from the Istanbul Sözleşmesi or the Istanbul Convention. So there's also been a little bit of a renewed focus on femicide and gender-based violence. So this question, they're wondering if there are refugee voices being included in this conversation since the lockdown period following COVID revealed an increase in gender-based violence globally. And yeah, whoever would feel comfortable answering this question. I know, Shilan, you spoke a little bit more about gender-based violence earlier. If you have any input on this question.
I can say that we need to do focus group discussions to understand the voice of Syrian women more. But I can say that from the Air Japan side, we always inform beneficiaries about 6284 law, and we always inform beneficiaries their rights and which depends the Istanbul Convention. And where to apply and hotline numbers. But as I say, there need to be focus group discussions and another projects to understand their voice in this Istanbul Convention and Pinar Gültekin discussion.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's get to another question. So We talked about refugees' access to employment and some of the work that you civil society organizations have been doing. So this question is about the World Bank's IDA 19 funding window. So they're saying Turkey no longer features among the World Bank's IDA 19 funding window, partly because of the notion that the government of Turkey and civil society organizations are already doing a great job and don't need additional support. Do you agree? I'm not sure if anyone has anything to say on this topic.
I can add a small remark about that. So maybe not through that mechanism, but we anticipate, this is not formalized information perhaps, but we know that in the near future, World Bank will be cooperating with ECHO, European Union's civil protection and humanitarian aid program, to facilitate implementation and programming of more funds that do not just focus on protection priorities, on priorities associated with immediate risks, but also development and resilience oriented priorities. Perhaps it will be a different model than what World Bank was doing in the country earlier, but we know that both with regard to World Bank and in other actors, there will be more being done in terms of this sort of holistic interventions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was another question. I could just jump into it. So this question is from Nurcan Çetinbaş, and she's asking, do you think money from other countries is enough to support refugees? And is the Turkish government using this money appropriately? And to what extent do you collaborate with the money? So I think this question just has to do with external funding. I was wondering if any of you have anything to input there.
I will provide a very short answer and then leave the floor to my colleagues. A reference point in this regard could be 3RP, Refugee Response and Resilience Mechanism, and that's basically the whole coordinating unit managed by the United Nations, and that involves not only just Turkey but other countries like in the area that also host a large number of refugees. And the way it works is annually 3RP goes for an appeal, let's say. That's basically is a statement, not to get too technical. It's a very good statement that says we need this many million or hundreds of millions of dollars, liras, etc., to fund the immediate humanitarian needs in this area. And so far, there hasn't been a single year where 3RP's appeal reached 100%. So that answers whether is it enough sort of segment of the question. And about how the funds are spent, about the transparency, accountability part of the question, it's a criteria. The external INGOs or external governments really prioritize the fact that humanitarian aid needs to be neutral, accountable, transparent, and unbiased. And so far, the Turkish government has covered tremendous ground. In the first phase of the Syrian displacement, there was no internal capacity within the government. It was utter chaos, really. But gradually, we saw the capacities building, and the government also be willing to collaborate more and more with national NGOs and INGOs to learn from them and to gain the capacity. This was hampered a little bit by the post 15th of July coup attempts due to national security issues. There was a big sort of climate of mistrust among public and civil actors. But now we are gaining traction again, and I think there is room for collaboration. The government should perhaps do more in terms of being accountable and transparent in terms of how it spends its funds. And to just address the final part of the question very briefly, we have to remember that by definition, humanitarian aid is there to support provision of basic services when the government capacities are overstretched due to situations of conflict or disaster or etc. So by definition, we have to collaborate with the government, help them regain the capacity they lost, transfer our expertise to them, and ultimately we are working for a world where humanitarian actors are not needed and the governments can provide the services themselves.
All right. So yeah, if nobody else has anything to say on
John,
that
just
question.
very quick contribution to that,
Yeah.
and I couldn't agree more what he was saying. But one thing, it's not directly related to this question, but regarding the funding that is appealed versus that is secured, it's never 100%, and there are hundreds of reasons for that. But there is one thing that actually Support to Life and Watan proudly that we are working quite hard, especially lately, on the localization agenda. So we do very much believe that the humanitarian funding should be localized so that there will be more effort that will be available on the field with less funding required amount and so on. So it's not maybe directly related, but I couldn't stop myself by not mentioning that, because it is agreed with states, INGOs, and lots of international entities that it has to be localized in the grant bargain in the UK. But since then, there is very, very small progress on that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for those finishing thoughts, Ömer. So yeah, with that, I'm going to wrap up the panel. So I want to thank all of you, first of all, for joining us today and speaking on this important topic and spreading some good ideas. I think that we've all sort of learned from each other a little bit too. Also, thank you to the audience who is watching from home or work. And so be sure to check out the important work of the organizations represented by our panelists today. So once again, we have Support to Life, or Hayata Destek. We have the Vatan Foundation. We also have AAR Japan. And then we have the Refugees and Asylum Seekers Assistance and Solidarity Association, or RASAS for short. If you're interested in other events like this on refugee assistance, Turkey in general, or humanitarian aid, please visit us at HasNa.org and follow us on social media. And once again, thank everybody for their time and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.